That paint line represents the true boundary based on the 1988 plat.
The first thing I saw that Saturday morning was not sunlight, not my old oak tree, not even Cooper waiting by the back door like he usually did. It was a brand new white fence cutting straight through my backyard like someone had drawn a line through my life while I was asleep. 9 feet of my yard were gone. The narrow strip of grass where my wife used to plant lavender was behind that fence now. The little stone border I had laid by hand was half buried under fresh dirt. My sprinkler line was snapped open near the ground, still leaking in slow pulses. And the wooden bench my wife had loved, the one that had sat beneath the oak tree for almost 12 years, was tipped over on its side with one leg cracked clean through. On the other side of the fence, my neighbor, Richard Bell, stood with 2 workers and a clipboard, looking over my property like he had just conquered it. I did not climb the fence. I did not rip anything out. I did not yell, even though every part of me wanted to. I just stood there in my slippers, staring at a structure that had not existed the night before, trying to understand how a man could take part of someone's land before breakfast and still look proud of himself. By noon, the HOA had already emailed me a violation notice. According to them, Richard's new fence had been approved as a boundary correction, and any attempt by me to remove, damage, or interfere with it would result in a daily fine, $500 a day, for touching a fence built on my own land. That was the moment I understood this was not just a neighbor dispute. This was not a misunderstanding over a few inches of grass. Richard had not acted alone. The HOA had backed him, protected him, and tried to scare me into accepting a lie because they thought I was the kind of homeowner who would rather swallow the loss than fight paperwork, meetings, and legal threats. 3 weeks later, that same fence was covered in Orange County markings. Richard's pool project was shut down. His contractor was under investigation. The HOA president was sitting in a public meeting trying to explain why the board had fined a homeowner for defending his own property. And all of it started with one quiet little metal survey pin near the roots of my oak tree, something Richard had never noticed, and something the HOA should have checked before they decided my land was easier to steal than to verify. Before Richard Bell moved in next door, my life in that neighborhood was quiet enough to forget an HOA even existed. I had bought the house 16 years earlier with my wife, Melissa, after saving every spare dollar we could. It was not the biggest house on the block, and it was not the newest, but to us it felt like the first place where we could breathe without asking anyone's permission. The backyard was the reason Melissa loved it. There was an old oak tree near the left corner, a narrow strip of grass along the side fence, and just enough open space for a small garden. She planted lavender there the first spring after we moved in. Later, when the heat got too strong in July, she put a wooden bench under the oak so we could sit outside in the evenings with iced tea and listen to sprinklers clicking down the street. After she passed, that yard became more than dirt and grass to me. It became the one part of the house where I still felt her presence the strongest. I did not turn it into a shrine, and I did not tell people dramatic stories about it. I just kept the grass trimmed, repaired the bench when it weathered, watered the lavender when it tried to come back, and walked my old dog Cooper along that same fence every morning before work. I was not rich. I worked as an HVAC maintenance technician, which meant long days in attics, crawl spaces, rooftops, and parking lot mechanical rooms. I fixed other people's air conditioners in the Georgia heat, came home tired, paid my HOA dues on time, and minded my own business. I was the kind of neighbor who waved, brought trash cans in before sunset, and avoided HOA meetings unless something directly affected my street. For years, that was enough. The HOA sent the usual reminders about lawn height, mailbox paint, holiday decorations, and trash bins. I did not always love the rules, but I followed them because I wanted peace. I had no interest in becoming the angry homeowner everyone whispered about at community meetings. Then Richard bought the house next door. From the first week, it was clear Richard did not see the neighborhood the way most of us did. He saw it like a project he was entitled to redesign. His contractors came and went before he had even unpacked. Landscapers ripped out shrubs. A designer measured the backyard. Delivery trucks blocked half the street. By the second month, everyone knew he was planning a pool, an outdoor kitchen, and a large stone patio behind his house. The problem was space. His lot was narrower than mine, and the back corner of his yard curved toward a drainage area. I heard from another neighbor that Richard was frustrated because county setback rules limited what he could build. Around that same time, he started paying unusual attention to my side yard. He would stand near the old fence with a tablet in his hand, looking back and forth between the ground and his screen, as if the land itself had personally offended him. I did not confront him then. I told myself he was just measuring for his own project. I told myself the old fence had been there since before I bought the house, and my closing documents had included a survey. I told myself a grown man would not try to solve his pool problem by taking another person's yard. That was my mistake, because while I was choosing peace, Richard was choosing paperwork. While I was going to work, walking Cooper, and trying to keep my life simple, he was making friends with the HOA president, attending board meetings, and presenting himself as the kind of homeowner who would increase property values for everyone. The board liked people like Richard. He was confident, polished, and willing to spend money where everyone could see it. And if you have ever lived under an HOA, or had a neighbor who acted like rules only applied to other people, you already know how dangerous that combination can become. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the quietest property disputes are the ones that turn your whole life upside down. I just did not know yet that Richard had found a way to make the HOA see my land as the solution to his problem. And by the time I understood what they were doing, they had already put their plan in writing. The first official sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening, buried inside an HOA email, with the subject line written so politely it almost felt harmless. It said the board had reviewed and approved a boundary correction fence between my property and Richard Bell's property. According to them, the existing fence was inconsistent with the community layout, and Richard had been authorized to replace it with a fence that reflected the proper line. I read that email 3 times before I understood what they were really saying. They were not asking me about my land. They were not requesting permission to access my yard. They were not even warning me that a contractor might be near the property line. They were telling me that a decision had already been made about a boundary I owned, using paperwork I had never seen, based on a claim I had never been allowed to challenge. I replied that same night. I asked for the survey they had relied on, the plat map they were using, the minutes from the board meeting, and the specific HOA rule that allowed them to approve a property line change between 2 private lots. I kept the message calm because I still believed this could be corrected with facts. The answer came the next morning, short and cold. The board said Richard's improvement application had been properly reviewed, and any concerns I had should be addressed through the neighborhood dispute process. That was the first time I saw how carefully they had built the trap. They were calling it a neighbor dispute while using HOA authority to pressure me. They were treating Richard's project as approved while treating my objection as a nuisance. And because they used words like correction, improvement, and compliance, they made theft sound like paperwork. 2 days later, I came home from work and found orange utility flags pushed into the ground on my side of the old fence. Some were almost 10 feet inside my yard. At first, I thought a worker had made a mistake. Then I saw Richard standing near his patio with a contractor, pointing toward my oak tree like the land around it was part of his construction plan. When he noticed me watching, he did not look embarrassed. He gave me the kind of smile a man gives when he believes the argument is already over. I contacted the HOA again and told them no one had permission to enter my property. They responded by reminding me that interference with approved exterior improvements could result in fines, suspension of community privileges, and a hearing before the board. The message did not mention my deed. It did not mention a survey. It did not mention county records. It only mentioned penalties. The next morning, I left for a service call before sunrise. Cooper was still asleep in the kitchen, and the old fence was still there when I pulled out of the driveway. By the time I returned in the late afternoon, the fence was gone. Not damaged, not partly removed. Gone. The line of weathered boards that had stood there for years had been ripped out and hauled away. In its place were fresh post holes running across my yard at an angle that made my stomach drop. The grass was torn up in muddy strips. The lavender bed Melissa had planted was crushed under boot prints and tire tracks. The sprinkler pipe near the side yard was sliced open, leaving a dark, wet patch spreading under the soil. A stack of white fence panels leaned against my oak tree, and one of the workers had tossed an empty drink cup onto my lawn like the place had become a job site. Richard stood behind the new posts, watching the crew work. He looked relaxed, almost pleased. When I walked over and asked why his contractor was on my property, he acted as though I was the unreasonable one. He said the HOA had already settled the boundary issue, that the old fence had been wrong for years, and that I should be grateful he was paying for a nicer replacement. He made it clear he believed I did not have the money, patience, or knowledge to fight him. I asked the workers to stop until the county could verify the line. They kept working. One of them looked at Richard before answering me, and that told me everything I needed to know. They were not confused. They had been told to ignore me. By sunset, the new white fence was standing. It cut through my yard in a clean, arrogant line, swallowing the strip of grass where I had walked Cooper every morning, and boxing off the bench under the oak, like Richard had decided even my memories were in his way. When I stepped closer, I saw the bench lying on its side. One leg had cracked where someone had shoved it or dropped something against it. For a few seconds, I forgot about the property line, the HOA, the fines, and the legal words. I just saw Melissa's bench broken in the dirt. That night, the second HOA notice arrived. This one accused me of creating a hostile environment for an approved contractor and threatening a neighboring homeowner's improvement project. The fine was $250, with a warning that continued interference could raise it to $500 per day. They also ordered me not to touch the new fence until the board reviewed my conduct. Richard had taken my land. His contractor had torn up my yard. The HOA had approved a fence without proving the boundary. And somehow, on paper, I was the problem. For one long moment, I wanted to walk outside with a crowbar and tear every white panel out of the ground. I wanted to drag the broken boards onto Richard's driveway and make him look at what he had done. But anger would have given them exactly what they wanted. One bad decision from me, and the story would stop being about stolen land. It would become about a homeowner who destroyed a fence the HOA had approved. So I did nothing that night except stand under the porch light, take pictures of every post, every tire mark, every broken piece of irrigation pipe, and every inch of grass they had stolen. Then, near the roots of the old oak tree, just beyond the fresh dirt, my flashlight caught a small round piece of metal pressed into the ground. It was old, dull, and almost hidden under the leaves, but I recognized it from the survey paperwork I had signed 16 years earlier. It was a property marker. I did not touch the fence. That was the hardest decision I made that night, because every part of me wanted to prove a point with my hands. But the longer I stood there looking at that little metal property marker by the oak tree, the clearer my thinking became. Richard wanted me angry. The HOA wanted me careless. If I tore down one panel, kicked one post, or even dragged one board across the grass, they would turn the whole story against me by morning. So I went back inside, washed the dirt off my hands, made coffee I did not drink, and opened the old fireproof box where Melissa and I had kept every important document from the day we bought the house. The closing folder was still there, yellowed at the edges, thick with papers I had not looked at in years. I spread them across the kitchen table under the overhead light: the deed, the title policy, the plat map, the old survey, the HOA covenants, and the inspection report from when the house was still ours, only on paper. Cooper lay beside my chair, restless, as if he knew the quiet in that kitchen was not peace. It was preparation. The old survey showed exactly what I remembered. The original fence line followed the boundary between the two lots, with a narrow drainage strip running along my side yard. The oak tree, the lavender bed, and the bench were all clearly inside my property. The new fence, based on my rough measurements, was not off by a few inches. It was deep into my lot, almost 9 feet at the widest point. I took photos of every page. Then I started building a folder on my laptop. I saved the HOA's emails, the violation notices, the fine letter, and every message where they called Richard's fence a boundary correction. I downloaded the doorbell camera footage showing the contractor arriving before I came home. I copied the backyard camera footage that showed workers pulling up the old fence, stepping through my garden, cutting across my grass, and stacking panels under my oak tree. The camera did not capture everything, but it captured enough. It showed Richard standing there with a clipboard while the workers operated on my side of the line. It showed one worker dragging something heavy near Melissa's bench. It showed the moment the sprinkler line started leaking after a post-hole digger went into the ground. By midnight, I had created a timeline. Date, time, event, evidence. I did not write how angry I was. I did not write what I wanted to say to Richard. I kept it plain because plain facts are harder to twist than emotion. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office and requested the recorded plat for my subdivision. Then I searched the county property records online and pulled both my parcel and Richard's. The lot dimensions matched my deed, not the HOA's version. Richard's lot had not magically grown wider because he wanted a pool. Mine had not shrunk because the HOA president liked his renovation plans. After that, I checked the permit database. Richard had applied for work behind his house, including patio preparation and preliminary pool grading, but there was no permit that allowed him to relocate a boundary fence onto my parcel. There was no document showing a new survey. There was no recorded agreement between our properties, no easement transfer, no boundary adjustment, and no county approval for a permanent structure inside the drainage area. That was when I realized the HOA had not verified the property line at all. They had approved the appearance of a fence and then used that approval like a weapon, hoping I would not know the difference between architectural permission and legal ownership. I called a licensed surveyor named Miles Grant, a quiet man whose office sounded like it had more paper maps than furniture. I sent him my deed, the old survey, photos of the marker, and images of the new fence. He did not promise anything dramatic. He only said the records would tell the truth if the markers were still there. 2 days later, Miles walked my yard with GPS equipment, a metal detector, and the kind of patience that made Richard visibly uncomfortable from his patio. Richard watched us the entire time. The HOA president even drove by slowly once, pretending not to stare. I said almost nothing. I let the equipment speak. Miles found the marker near the oak tree. Then he found another near the drainage inlet. Then a third near the back corner where the old fence had turned. Each one lined up with the original survey. Each one made the new fence look worse. When Miles finished, he looked at the white panels, then at the notes on his clipboard. He did not raise his voice. He did not act surprised. But his expression told me what I needed to know before the official report arrived. That fence was not on the line. It was on my land. That evening, I sent one calm email to the HOA, Richard, and the contractor. I attached the original survey, photos of the property marker, screenshots from the permit database, and a formal request that all work stop until the county and a licensed surveyor reviewed the boundary. I asked them to preserve all emails, approvals, contractor documents, and board communications related to the fence. The HOA did not apologize. Richard did not remove a single panel. Instead, the board scheduled a hearing about my alleged interference and warned me that additional fines might be added if I continued escalating the matter outside the community process. But by then, their process no longer mattered. Because I had the deed, I had the survey, I had the camera footage, I had the permit records, and within 48 hours, I had a stamped survey report showing the one detail Richard and the HOA had gambled I would never prove. They had not corrected a boundary. They had crossed one. The survey report arrived on a Thursday afternoon as a PDF attachment from Miles Grant's office. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my hand on the mouse, staring at the file name for a few seconds before I opened it. There was no dramatic music, no crowd, no judge, just a quiet kitchen, an old dog sleeping by the back door, and the kind of document that can turn a bully's confidence into evidence. The first page was simple. It identified my parcel, Richard's parcel, the recorded plat, the existing monuments, and the new fence line. The second page was where everything changed. Miles had drawn the true property line in one color and Richard's new fence in another. The two lines were not even close. At the widest point, Richard's fence sat nearly 9 feet inside my property. It ran that way for most of the side yard before cutting back near the rear corner, stealing a long strip of land that had belonged to my deed the entire time. But the real turning point was not just the property line, it was the note under the surveyor's certification. That strip of land included a recorded drainage easement. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. I had seen the easement mentioned in my closing documents years ago, but I had never thought much about it. It was one of those technical things homeowners sign during closing, while everyone is pointing at tabs and rushing through paperwork. To me, it had always meant the county had the right to access that side area if there was ever a drainage issue. To Richard, it meant something much worse. It meant he had not only built on land he did not own, he had placed a permanent fence across an area the county had legally reserved for stormwater drainage and maintenance access. That changed the entire tone of the dispute. It was no longer just my word against his. It was no longer an HOA argument about appearance, community standards, or neighborhood improvement. Richard's fence was now sitting in a protected easement where it had no business being. I sent the report to a real estate attorney named Karen Whitcomb, whose office was 2 towns over and whose calm voice made me feel like the floor had finally stopped moving under my feet. She reviewed the survey, my deed, the HOA notices, the camera footage, the permit records, and the photos of the damage. Then she prepared a demand letter that was sharper than anything I could have written while angry. The letter went to Richard, the contractor, and the HOA board. It demanded immediate removal of the fence from my property, restoration of the damaged grass and irrigation, compensation for the broken bench and garden bed, cancellation of all HOA fines, and preservation of every communication related to the fence approval. It also stated that the fence appeared to violate the recorded drainage easement and that the matter would be forwarded to county code enforcement if they refused to correct it. That was the first time Richard's confidence cracked. He did not come to my door, because people like Richard are brave when they have an audience and careful when paper starts moving through attorneys. Instead, he sent a stiff email claiming the issue had been created by outdated records and that he had relied in good faith on HOA approval. He wrote as though the land had confused him, as though survey markers, deeds, and county plats were just opinions that had failed to make themselves convenient. The HOA's response was even more revealing. They suddenly insisted they had approved only the style and color of the fence, not its location. They wrote that all property line matters were the responsibility of individual homeowners, but I had their earlier emails saved. I had the phrase boundary correction in writing. I had their warning that I would be fined for interfering with Richard's approved fence. They had not acted like neutral reviewers then. They had acted like enforcers. Karen noticed that immediately. She added the HOA's prior emails to the case file and told me not to argue with them directly anymore. From that point forward, everything had to stay clean, documented, and boring. No emotional replies, no threats, no insults, just records, dates, damages, and legal notices. Then the permit issue got worse for Richard. I forwarded the survey and photos to the county building department along with the permit number listed under Richard's backyard project. The permit drawings showed work behind his house, but they did not show a fence built across my parcel, and they definitely did not show a structure crossing the drainage easement. The patio preparation was also closer to the disputed area than the plans suggested. If the fence line Richard used was false, then the spacing for the rest of his project might also be false. That meant his pool dream was now tied to a paper trail he could not smooth talk his way out of. 2 days later, Richard tried to settle the matter privately. His offer was insulting. He wanted to leave the fence where it was temporarily, pay for the sprinkler repair, and discuss a landscaping credit later. He framed it as a neighborly solution, as if the neighborly part had not ended the moment he sent workers into my yard without permission. He did not mention the easement. He did not mention the bench. He did not mention the HOA fines. Most importantly, he did not offer to give back the land. I declined through my attorney. After that, everything moved quickly. The county scheduled an inspection. Code enforcement opened a file. Karen sent a second letter warning that continued refusal to remove the fence could lead to claims for trespass, property damage, and recovery of legal costs. The contractor, who had ignored me in my own yard, suddenly became very interested in who had told him the line was correct. By the time I saw Richard again, he was standing on his patio with his arms crossed, watching the white fence like it had betrayed him. The same fence that had made him look powerful 3 weeks earlier now looked like a confession nailed into the ground. And on Monday morning, when the county inspector pulled up in front of my house with a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and a can of orange marking paint, Richard finally understood something I had learned the hard way. A fence can be built overnight, but a property line does not move just because someone rich wants more room. The county inspector arrived just after 9 in the morning, and the first thing Richard did was walk toward him, like this was still a social problem he could manage with confidence. He had that same polished smile, the same folded arms, the same look he used at HOA meetings when he wanted everyone to believe he was the reasonable adult in the room. But the inspector was not there to admire anyone's confidence. He started with the documents. I handed him the stamped survey from Miles Grant, my deed, the recorded plat, photos of the old fence line, screenshots from the permit database, and the HOA emails calling Richard's fence a boundary correction. Then I stepped back. I had learned by then that the strongest thing I could do was stop trying to convince people and let the records speak for themselves. Richard tried to explain that the HOA had approved the fence. The inspector listened without reacting, then checked the survey against the ground markers. Miles had come back that morning to be present, and he located the metal pins again with calm precision. One near the oak tree, one near the drainage inlet, one near the rear corner. Each marker lined up with my deed. Each one made Richard's white fence look more ridiculous. Then the inspector walked the fence line with a measuring wheel. He stopped near the widest point, looked down at the orange flags Miles had placed, and marked the ground with bright orange paint. The paint line ran several feet away from Richard's fence, on the side Richard had claimed was his. In that moment, the whole lie became visible. It was no longer hidden in emails, excuses, or HOA language. Anyone standing there could see it. The fence was not close to the line, it was on my property. Code enforcement arrived a short time later, and the mood changed completely. The drainage easement made everything worse for Richard. The officer reviewed the county record and confirmed that a permanent structure had been placed across an easement without approval. That meant access for stormwater maintenance had been blocked, and if drainage failed during a heavy rain, the damage might not stop at my yard. It could affect other homes in the subdivision. That was when Richard stopped smiling. The contractor looked even more nervous. He had built exactly where Richard had told him to build, but the permit drawings did not match the real property line. The fence relocation was not covered the way Richard had implied. The patio preparation was now under review because its setback depended on a boundary that had been falsely treated as corrected. Code enforcement issued a stop work order for the backyard project until the county could review the entire file. For the first time since this started, Richard had no audience that cared about his status. The inspector did not care that he knew the HOA president. Code enforcement did not care that his pool was expensive. The surveyor did not care that Richard wanted the old fence to be wrong. The only thing that mattered was the recorded line, the easement, and the work already done without proper authority. A week later, the HOA called an emergency board meeting because my attorney had requested their approval file, internal emails, hearing notes, and every communication about my fines. I went to that meeting with a folder, not a speech. I placed the survey on the table, then the county notice, then the photos of my damaged yard, then the HOA emails warning me not to interfere with a fence they now claimed they had only approved for color and style. The room went quiet in a way I had never heard at an HOA meeting before. Residents who had ignored the issue when they thought it was just a dispute between two neighbors started paying attention when they realized the board had tried to punish a homeowner for objecting to construction on his own land. One man asked why the HOA had used the phrase boundary correction if they had no authority to verify a boundary. Another asked whether the board had approved other projects near property lines without surveys. No one from the board had a clean answer. Then my attorney read from one of the internal emails the HOA had been forced to produce. The president had written that Richard's project would improve the look of the neighborhood and that delaying it over Daniel's complaint would create unnecessary conflict with a valuable homeowner. A valuable homeowner. That phrase did more damage than any insult could have. In one sentence, the board had admitted what I had felt from the beginning. They had not treated this like a question of ownership. They had treated it like a question of who mattered more. By the end of the meeting, the county file was official. Richard's project was frozen, the contractor was facing review, and the HOA had been told by its own counsel to suspend every fine against me while the matter was investigated. The same people who had warned me to stay quiet were suddenly choosing their words very carefully. And when the final county letter arrived 3 days later, it did not ask Richard to consider moving the fence. It ordered him to remove it. Richard had 10 days to remove the fence, but he did not wait that long. By the third morning, a different crew showed up, quieter than the first one, with no music, no joking, and no clipboard confidence. They pulled the white panels out one by one while a county inspector watched from the edge of my yard. Every post came up from the wrong side of the orange line. Every hole they filled was another small admission that the land had never belonged to him. The pool project stopped completely. Richard had to submit new plans, this time with the real property line and the drainage easement clearly marked. The patio design had to be reduced, the pool shifted, and the outdoor kitchen he had bragged about at the HOA meeting was removed from the plan entirely. The contractor was cited for working outside the permitted area, and after the county review, he lost 2 other jobs in the neighborhood because people suddenly started asking for surveys before signing anything. Richard also had to pay for the damage. The irrigation line was repaired by a licensed company. The torn grass was replaced. The lavender bed was rebuilt. The old bench under the oak tree could not be restored perfectly, but the settlement covered a craftsman who repaired the broken leg and reinforced the frame without changing the way it looked. That mattered to me more than Richard ever understood. The HOA tried to make the whole thing disappear quietly, but the residents would not let them. The board canceled every fine they had issued against me, refunded the hearing fee, and sent a formal apology that sounded like it had been written by 3 lawyers afraid of every word. At the next community meeting, the president was voted out. The new board passed a rule requiring a current survey before any fence, wall, patio, or structure could be approved near a property line. Richard never apologized to my face. People like him rarely do. But he stopped waving at me with that smug little smile, stopped standing near the fence line like he owned the air around it, and stopped using the HOA as a weapon. For the first time in months, my backyard felt quiet again. A few weeks later, I planted new lavender along the same strip of grass Melissa had loved. Cooper lay under the oak tree while I worked, his gray muzzle resting near the little metal survey pin that had saved more than just a few feet of yard. It had saved the truth from being buried under money, arrogance, and official-looking emails. I did not win because I was louder than Richard. I won because I stayed calm when they wanted me angry. I saved every message. I checked every record. I trusted the deed, the survey, the county file, and the facts beneath my own feet. So if you have ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or anyone else try to make you feel powerless on your own property, remember this: boundaries only matter when you are willing to defend them the right way. Keep your documents, keep your evidence, ask questions before you back down. And if this story made you think of someone who needs to hear it, share it with them, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where ordinary homeowners fight back with facts instead of fear.